My name is Tola Mensah. I am 33 years old, and until 7 weeks ago I was a senior compliance associate at a healthcare consulting firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. I filed my first complaint with HR on the 14th of March. It was detailed, specific, and supported by documentation. It described a pattern of conduct by my direct manager, Mr. Crane, that included repeated exclusion from meetings I was contractually responsible for, the reassignment of my client accounts without notice or explanation, and 2 instances where he had misrepresented my work in written communications to firm leadership. HR acknowledged receipt on the 15th of March. Then nothing happened. I filed a follow-up on the 4th of April. HR acknowledged receipt. Nothing happened. I filed a second follow-up on the 22nd of April. A coordinator named Ms. Briggs told me the matter was under review. Nothing happened. I filed a third follow-up on the 9th of May. Ms. Briggs told me reviews of this nature took time, and that I would be contacted when there was an update to share. I was not contacted. On the 17th of June, the firm's external regulatory audit was announced. A mandatory 3-day site visit from the relevant state health oversight body, scheduled for the second week of August. All departments were required to provide full documentation of their compliance activities, processes, and personnel records for the preceding 18 months. I read the audit announcement at my desk at 11:42 in the morning. I sat with it for a moment. Then I opened my folder, the one I had been building since the 3rd of February, and I started preparing a different kind of submission. Not to HR. To the auditors. I had come to the firm 2 years and 1 month before the March complaint. I had joined at 31 from a regional hospital network where I had spent 3 years in the regulatory compliance function, audit preparation, policy documentation, staff training, the specific disciplined work of making sure a healthcare organization's practices matched its obligations. I was good at it. Not in a visible way. Compliance work is rarely visible when it is done correctly, but in the way that build a record of examinations passed, and audits cleared and findings that came back clean. The firm had recruited me specifically for the healthcare compliance function that was growing with a new state contract. I had been told, in my hiring conversation, that I would be the lead compliance associate on the new contract portfolio, with a clear growth path into the senior compliance manager role as the portfolio expanded. That was what I had been told. Mr. Crane joined the firm 8 months after I did. He came from a consulting background, strategy and operations, with limited direct experience in healthcare compliance. He was appointed as the compliance functions department head. I reported to him. For the first 4 months, the structure worked adequately. He managed the commercial relationships. I managed the technical compliance work. The portfolio grew. The accounts were clean. Then, gradually and then less gradually, things changed. The changes were small individually. Together they had a direction. I noticed the direction in October. I began documenting in February. I filed the complaint in March. The complaint was ignored for 3 months. And then the audit was announced. I want to be precise about what the complaint contained and why it mattered for the audit. The compliance function at the firm was responsible for maintaining documentation that demonstrated, to regulatory satisfaction, that the firm's healthcare consulting practices met the applicable state and federal standards. This was not optional or procedural. It was a condition of the firm's contract with the state and a requirement for the firm's operating license in the healthcare consulting sector. In October, Mr. Crane had begun removing me from client account meetings without explanation. These were not peripheral meetings. They were the meetings where compliance requirements were reviewed and documented. The meetings that generated the records the auditors would examine. By January, I had been excluded from 11 compliance review meetings across 4 accounts. In my place, Mr. Crane had attended and submitted meeting summaries under the account records. Those summaries described compliance reviews that I had not conducted, assessments I had not made, and documentation processes I had not approved. The compliance records for those accounts were, in a material regulatory sense, inaccurate, not fabricated from nothing, based on real meetings, but attributed to a compliance process that had not been followed. Meetings conducted without the qualified compliance lead, producing assessments that did not meet the documentation standards the firm was contractually required to maintain. The complaint I had filed in March was not about exclusion as a professional slight. It was about a documented gap between the compliance records and the actual compliance process. When the audit was announced, that gap became something else entirely. It became a finding in progress, waiting to be discovered by the auditors unless it was disclosed first. The folder I had been building since February held 4 months of documentation. It was organized in sections. Section 1. The original compliance process documentation. The meeting schedules, attendance records, and process standards that defined how compliance reviews were supposed to be conducted for the firm's healthcare accounts. Section 2. The exclusion record. 11 instances across 4 accounts where I had been removed from compliance meetings I was responsible for, documented by the original meeting invitations, the removal notifications, and, in 3 cases, direct messages from Mr. Crane telling me my attendance was not required for specific sessions. Section 3. The account compliance records as filed. The summaries Mr. Crane had submitted, time-stamped, showing that compliance reviews had been conducted per standard process. Section 4. The gap analysis. A document I had built across 2 weeks in February, comparing what the filed records described against what the documented process required. 11 instances. 4 accounts. A compliance gap that was specific, measurable, and impossible to characterize as procedural variation. Section 5. The complaint history. The March 14th filing. The follow-ups. The acknowledgements. The 3-month absence of any substantive response. 5 months of documented institutional inaction against a documented compliance concern. When the audit was announced, the gap between Section 3 and Section 4 became an active regulatory risk. And the gap between Section 5 and the date of the announcement became something else. Evidence that the firm had been informed of the compliance issue and had not acted. I spent the evening of the 17th of June organizing the folder into a format appropriate for external submission. I called my aunt, Auntie Cora, that evening. Not my mother. She would have told me to be careful, to think about my job, to consider whether there was another way. Auntie Cora had spent 22 years as a compliance director at a regional hospital and had retired 6 months earlier. She understood, with precision, what the folder contained and what it meant. I told her everything. The October exclusions, the gap analysis, the complaint filing, the 3 months of institutional inaction, the audit announcement. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. The firm has been informed, she said. Yes, I said. 5 times. By documented submission. Acknowledged each time. And the compliance gap is material. 11 instances across 4 active accounts, I said. All within the audit scope period. She was quiet again. Tola, she said. You understand what happens if the auditors find this independently? If they pull the account records and identify the gap without a prior disclosure from the firm? Yes, I said. The finding is significantly more serious than a self-reported correction. It implicates the firm's oversight process and potentially the compliance personnel. And you understand what happens if you make a direct submission to the audit team? Yes, I said. I become a protected reporter under the state's healthcare compliance whistleblower framework. The firm cannot take adverse action against me in connection with a submitted report. She said, have you already drafted it? Most of it, I said. Send it to a lawyer before you submit, she said. Tonight if you can. The protection only applies if the submission is properly framed. She gave me the name of someone she knew. I called that number at 8:15 that evening. My colleague Amara had been watching the situation for longer than she had said anything. She came to my desk on the morning after the audit announcement. She had the particular quality of someone who had been deciding whether to say something for a long time and had just decided. She sat down. The audit is August, she said. Yes, I said. The account compliance records, she said. For the Harwick, Belmont, and Caldwell accounts. I looked at her. I processed the billing for those accounts, she said. I've seen the compliance meeting summaries. The ones Crane submits. She paused. The billing cycle dates on those summaries don't match the calendar invitations I get for the meetings. She paused again. The meetings he submits as compliance reviews happen after the billing cycle closes. Compliance reviews are supposed to happen before. I said, that's a timing discrepancy. It's more than a timing discrepancy, she said. If the compliance review happens after the billing cycle closes, the review can't have informed the billing submission, which means the billing submissions were made without a contemporaneous compliance review. I had not known about the billing timing issue. I had the exclusion documentation. She had the billing timeline. Would you be willing to provide a formal account of this? I said. She said, I've been waiting for someone to ask. She had been watching the folder fill for 4 months without knowing I had a folder. We had been building the same case from different angles. I sat with that. 2 people in the same building, watching the same gap develop, documenting it from different positions, neither knowing the other was doing exactly the same thing. Sometimes the record builds itself, quietly, in parallel, waiting for the moment when the pieces find each other. We had just found each other. 6 weeks before the audit. The attorney was a woman named Ms. Okafor. She practiced healthcare regulatory law and employment law, which was the precise combination the situation required. I sent her the folder at 8:45 on the night of the audit announcement. She responded at 11 with a meeting request for the following morning. We met for 90 minutes. She reviewed the folder in the first 30 minutes and asked questions for the next 60. Her questions were specific, technical, and sequential. She was building a mental model of the documentation, testing it for gaps, identifying where it was strong, and where it needed reinforcement. At the end, she said, "The compliance gap documentation is solid. The exclusion record is clear and time-stamped. The complaint history establishes that the firm was informed and did not act." She paused. "The billing timing issue your colleague identified. If she will provide a formal statement, it adds a second independent documentation pathway to the same underlying gap. That significantly strengthens both the regulatory submission and any employment claim." She told me the state's healthcare oversight body had a formal voluntary disclosure process, a structured mechanism for reporting compliance concerns before an audit, which carried material protections for the reporting party and material mitigation benefits for the reporting organization. The disclosure needs to be properly framed as a voluntary report from a compliance professional with documented concerns, she said, not as an adversarial filing. She spent 20 minutes helping me understand the distinction. I spent 3 days drafting the submission with her guidance. It was submitted to the oversight body on the 21st of June, 4 days after the audit was announced. I submitted the voluntary disclosure on a Thursday morning. I did not tell anyone at the firm. I came into the office at my usual time. I attended my usual morning stand-up. I answered emails about a client deliverable that was due the following week. I had lunch at my desk. I acted in every external respect like a person whose week was entirely ordinary. This was not difficult. I had been doing a version of this for 4 months, maintaining a professional surface above a documentation project that was growing underneath it. I had learned, over those months, to move precisely in the gap between what was visible and what was real. Mr. Crane stopped by my desk at 2:15. He said, "Good progress on the Walton deliverable?" "On track," I said. "Great," he said. "Don't forget the Harwick compliance summary is due Friday." "I have it," I said. He nodded and moved on. I watched him go. I thought about what he did not know. He did not know about the folder. He did not know about Amara's statement, which she had sent to Ms. Okafor the previous evening. He did not know about the voluntary disclosure that was now sitting in the oversight body's intake system, time-stamped at 9:47 that morning. He knew there was an audit in August. He did not know that the audit had already started, that the voluntary disclosure was sitting in the oversight body's intake system, that Amara's formal statement was in Ms. Okafor's files, that the gap analysis had been updated with billing data that cross-referenced 3 accounts. He did not know that the documentation he would need to answer for in August had already been reviewed by the people who would be asking the questions. He did not know I had a folder. He had never thought to ask. The hardest part was a Wednesday evening in April. I had submitted the second follow-up to HR that day. Ms. Briggs had told me the matter was under review. I'd thanked her, and walked back to my desk, and sat for a long time looking at the folder on my screen. My partner, Kofi, came home at 7 and found me in the kitchen not cooking anything. He asked what was wrong. I told him about the follow-up, about the 3 weeks of silence since the first filing, about the specific, documented compliance gap that HR was apparently willing to allow to sit unresolved while accounts with inaccurate records continued to be active. He listened. Kofi was a quiet listener, the kind who waited for the full shape before responding. When I finished, he said, "Is this about your job or about the compliance problem?" I thought about it. "Both," I said. "Then which one matters more right now?" he said. I thought about it longer. "The compliance problem," I said. "If the compliance gap isn't corrected, the firm's accounts are operating with inaccurate records. That's a real regulatory risk. Real patients and real healthcare decisions are connected to those accounts." He was quiet. "Then the job is secondary," he said. "I know," I said. "But you're still worried about the job," he said. "Yes," I said. He was quiet again. "When the audit comes," he said, "you'll be glad you kept the folder." He didn't know when the audit would be announced. Neither did I, at that point. But he was right. The oversight body acknowledged the voluntary disclosure on the 23rd of June. A senior examiner named Mr. Ose contacted Ms. Okafor to confirm receipt and to indicate that the disclosure would be reviewed in connection with the scheduled audit. He noted that the reporting party was entitled to the protections provided under the state's healthcare compliance whistleblower statute. protection from adverse employment action and protection of the reporter's identity during the review period. He also noted that the firm would be required to respond to specific inquiries about the compliance documentation for the 4 accounts identified in the disclosure. Those inquiries would be issued as part of the pre-audit documentation request, which was standard procedure, and would not identify the source of the concerns. Ms. Okafor briefed me by phone that afternoon. "The protection is in place," she said. "Any adverse action taken against you now would create a separate, significant legal exposure for the firm." I asked, "What happens to the disclosure during the audit?" "The auditors will examine the compliance records for the identified accounts as part of their standard documentation review," she said. "If the gap you've documented is present in the records, they will find it independently. Your disclosure establishes that you reported it before they found it. That is the material difference between a voluntary correction and an adverse finding." "Does the firm know I submitted the disclosure?" "Not yet," she said. "They will know when the pre-audit inquiries arrive." She paused. "Tola," she said, "whatever happens next at the firm, you're protected. And the disclosure is real. It reflects a real compliance gap that needed to be reported." "I know," I said. "I had known that since February." The pre-audit documentation request arrived at the firm on the 5th of July. I know this because Mr. Crane called an emergency team meeting at 3 in the afternoon on the 5th of July. The first meeting he had called with me in attendance since January. He stood at the front of the room with the expression of a man who had received an unexpected communication and had not yet decided how to interpret it. "The oversight body has issued a pre-audit documentation request," he said. "It's standard procedure ahead of site visits. They've requested full compliance documentation for 4 specific accounts: Harwick, Belmont, Caldwell, and Moray." He looked around the room. "I need the full compliance record for each of these accounts ready for review by the 15th. Meeting attendances, review summaries, process documentation, all of it." He looked at me. "Tola, you're the compliance lead. I need you to pull the complete record." I said, "I'll have it for you by Wednesday." He nodded. After the meeting, I walked to my desk and sat for a moment. He had just asked me to compile the compliance records. The compliance records that contain the gap. The gap that was documented in my folder. The folder that was already in the oversight body's intake system, time-stamped the 21st of June. The same records the oversight body had already been briefed to examine. He had asked me to compile the documentation that would demonstrate, clearly and completely, exactly what I had already reported. I was going to pull the complete record. Every document of it. With care and precision. I compiled the account compliance records over the following 3 days. Every meeting summary, attendance record, and process document for the 4 accounts. Organized chronologically, with every version preserved. The full record as it had been filed. I also prepared, separately, the gap analysis document from my folder. Updated through June, with the billing timing data Amara had provided added as an appendix. On Wednesday morning, I delivered the account compliance records to Mr. Crane as requested. On Wednesday afternoon, I delivered the gap analysis document to Ms. Okafor, who forwarded it to Mr. Osei as a supplement to the original disclosure. Mr. Crane had the compliance records the oversight body would examine. The oversight body had the analysis showing what those records were missing. I had prepared both documents with the same care and precision. By Wednesday afternoon, the situation was fully documented on both sides of the audit process. Everything that needed to be in place was in place. I went home, made dinner, and called Auntie Cora. I told her what I had delivered and to whom. She said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly. "Like someone who has done everything they could," I said. "The records are accurate. The disclosure is in the right hands. The gap is documented on both sides of the process. And now it belongs to the audit." "That's the right feeling," she said. "When you've done the work correctly, there comes a moment where the work stops being yours and becomes the process. That moment is what you've been building toward." I sat with that. "Yes," I said. "That's exactly it." She had done this work for 22 years. She knew precisely what it felt like. Mr. Crane came to my desk on the 8th of July. He sat down across from me, which he had not done since November. The specific quality of his posture told me he had been preparing what he was about to say. He said, "I want to check in on how things are going." I said, "Fine. The Walton deliverable is on track." "Beyond the deliverable," he said. "Generally." I looked at him. "I know you filed a complaint with HR in March," he said. "I should have addressed that more directly at the time." I said nothing. "I want to make sure we're aligned going into the audit," he said. "The documentation request is straightforward. Standard records review. I'm confident our compliance process holds up. I said, I agree the documentation will tell the story. He looked at me for a moment. Something in my answer was not quite what he had expected, and he was trying to identify what it was. Is there anything you want to flag before the audit team arrives? He said. I thought about the folder. About the voluntary disclosure sitting in the oversight body system since the 21st of June. About the supplement Ms. Okafor had forwarded on Wednesday afternoon. About Mr. Osei's acknowledgement letter. I said, I've made sure everything is properly documented. He nodded slowly. He was trying to read something in my answer, and not quite reaching it. The answer was technically accurate, and completely uninformative. I had made sure everything was documented. That was precisely true. The documentation was in 3 places. His records request, the oversight body's intake system, and my folder. Good, he said. He went back to his office. I had not lied to him once. Everything I said was verifiable by anyone who looked at the records carefully. Accuracy without disclosure. I turned back to my screen. My mother called me the Sunday before the audit week. She had known, in general terms, that something significant had been happening at work since April. I had told her there was a difficult situation with my manager, that I was handling it carefully. I had not told her about the folder, or the disclosure, or the attorney. She would have worried in a way that would have required me to manage her worry alongside everything else. But she could hear things in my voice that I didn't put into words. And that Sunday she said, Tell me what's happening. I told her. All of it. From October to August. She was quiet for a long time after. Then she said, You built a file for 9 months, and you didn't tell me. I didn't want you to worry, I said. I worry anyway, she said. I would have worried less if I had known. I thought about that. You would have told me to be careful, I said. I would have, she said. And I would have been wrong, wouldn't I? A pause. I think so, I said carefully. She was quiet again. Your father kept records, she said. Everything. Receipts. Letters. Meeting notes. I used to tease him about it. She paused. He said, The record is the only thing that stays true when everything else becomes a matter of opinion. I had not heard her say that before. He would have understood, she said. My father had died when I was 12. I sat with that for a long time. Yes, I said. I think he would have. The audit team arrived on the 12th of August. 3 examiners from the state oversight body. They went directly to the documentation review room that the firm had prepared. A conference room on the 3rd floor with the requested account files already organized and waiting. I was not in that room. I was at my desk, working on the Walton deliverable, for the first 3 hours of the audit team's presence. At 11:15, Mr. Osei stopped at my desk. I had not met him in person. I knew him from the acknowledgement letter and from 2 brief calls with Ms. Okafor where she had described his approach. He was methodical and careful, and not given to unnecessary communication. He said, Ms. Mensah, I'm the lead examiner for this review. I'd like to schedule time with you this afternoon, if you're available. Of course, I said. My calendar is clear after 2. He said, 2 o'clock then. The documentation room. He moved on. Mr. Crane was standing at the end of the corridor. He had watched the exchange. His expression had the specific quality of a man putting things together that he had not previously assembled into a complete picture. I turned back to my work. At 2 o'clock I picked up my notebook, the physical one, where I had been writing contemporaneous notes throughout the audit period, dated and timed, and went to the documentation room. I had been keeping that notebook since October. Not on a computer. In a notebook. Because physical notes in handwriting, dated in pen, are difficult to characterize as having been constructed after the fact. Auntie Cora had told me that. I had started the habit before she said it. But it was good to have confirmation from 22 years of experience. The session with Mr. Osei lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. He asked me to walk him through the compliance process for each of the 4 accounts. The standard process is documented, the process as it had been conducted during the period under review, and my understanding of any gap between the 2. I walked him through it precisely. The process documentation. The 11 exclusion instances. The submitted summaries attributed to reviews I had not conducted. The gap analysis. The billing timing data Amara had provided. He had my voluntary disclosure and the supplementary analysis in front of him. He was cross-referencing what I was describing against the documentation I had submitted, confirming that what I was saying matched what I had written. It matched. Precisely. Because I had built the documentation to be accurate, and I was describing what the documentation said. At the end of the 2 hours, He asked 2 questions. The first, the complaint you filed with the firm's HR function in March. Can you describe the response? I described it. The acknowledgements. The 3 follow-ups. The 3-month absence of substantive action. The second, was the voluntary disclosure you submitted on the 21st of June prompted by the audit announcement? I said, the timing was connected. But the decision to disclose was based on the documented compliance gap. The audit announcement clarified that the gap would be reviewed regardless. I preferred to disclose it than have it discovered. He wrote something. Thank you, he said. He was precise and deliberate and gave nothing away. But I noticed that he'd been taking notes since my 3rd sentence. Amara and I had coffee the evening of the 2nd audit day. She had given her own session that morning. She did not tell me the specifics of what she had described, and I did not ask. The audit was an independent process, and I did not want anything I knew about her session to affect what I might be asked in subsequent conversations. She said, the examiner asked me for questions. I said, okay. 2 of them were about the billing cycle timing, she said. Specifically which accounts and which periods. He had the calendar data in front of him when he asked. He had the supplementary analysis. I said. She nodded. He understood it, she said. He understood it immediately. He didn't ask me to explain the billing cycle concept. He asked me to confirm specific instances. I thought about that. A regulatory examiner who had arrived at the documentation having already read a gap analysis that identified specific instances, with source documents attached, would ask very different questions from one encountering the gap for the first time. The disclosure had not just reported the problem. It had given the auditors a map. Tola, Amara said. I want to ask you something. Of course, I said. When you filed the first complaint in March, she said, did you think anything would happen? I thought about it. I thought something should happen, I said. I thought the correct thing would be for HR to investigate, and for the firm to correct the gap. That's what a functioning compliance oversight system does. But did you think it would? No, I said. By April I understood it wasn't going to. That's when I started preparing for the alternative. She nodded. The audit, she said. The audit, I said. The audit findings were issued 4 weeks after the site visit. Ms. Okafor briefed me on the preliminary findings before they were formally communicated to the firm. The oversight body had identified a material compliance gap in the records for 3 of the 4 accounts, Harwick, Belmont, and Caldwell. The Moray account had sufficient documentation to meet standard requirements. The gap in the other 3 accounts was characterized as a failure to maintain contemporaneous compliance review documentation, resulting in account records that did not reflect the actual compliance process. The gap was characterized as a systemic process failure rather than intentional falsification, a finding that reflected the evidence and that Ms. Okafor said was the most favorable characterization available given the documentation. The voluntary disclosure was formally noted as a mitigating factor in the examination report. The disclosure had been submitted before the audit site visit, had accurately described the gap, and had facilitated the audit team's efficient review of the relevant records. The firm received a corrective action order, remediation of the 3 affected accounts, implementation of a revised compliance review process with independent documentation requirements, and a 12-month oversight period during which the accounts would be subject to quarterly review. Mr. Crane was placed on administrative leave the day the preliminary findings were shared with the firm. I was not informed of this directly. I found out from Amara, who had heard it from someone in HR, the same HR function that had acknowledged my 5 submissions over 3 months without taking any action. The irony of that was not lost on me. I received a formal communication from the firm's general counsel acknowledging my voluntary disclosure and confirming my protected status under the whistleblower statute. It was 2 paragraphs on firm letterhead. Formal, careful, and precisely worded. I read it once. Then I filed it in the folder. Section 6. The 2 months between the audit and the formal findings had been the quietest stretch of the entire period. The firm had, after the audit team's arrival, begun behaving as organizations behave when they have received an unexpected external review. Carefully, deliberately, with every communication considered. Mr. Crane had become almost invisible, moving through the building with the reduced presence of someone who understood that everything was currently being observed. My own situation had been formally stabilized by the whistleblower protection. No adverse action had been taken or attempted. I had continued doing my work. I had continued documenting everything, because the practice was embedded now and felt wrong to stop. I had also, in the 3rd week of August, been asked to participate in a working group task with designing the revised compliance review process. The request had come from the General Counsel's office, not from HR, which had acknowledged my complaint 5 times without acting on it. Not from Mr. Crane, who was by that point absent from operational decisions. From the General Counsel, who had read the voluntary disclosure and understood what it described. I said yes. I said yes because the revised process was the thing that actually mattered. The administrative outcomes, the leave, the corrective action, the letter, those addressed what had happened. The revised process addressed what would happen next. That was where I wanted to put my energy. The revised process was built over 6 weeks. I led the documentation standards section. Amara led the billing integration section, which was new. The revised process required compliance reviews to be formally completed before billing submissions for the relevant accounts. The structure we built was the process the firm should have been running before Mr. Crane began removing me from the meetings. It was, in some ways, the process I had been trying to describe in the original March complaint. The audit had made the firm ready to hear it. A junior associate named Priya came to my desk 3 weeks after the formal findings. She had been at the firm 8 months. She worked in the compliance support function, administrative and coordination roles, not the substantive analysis work, but close enough to the function to understand what had happened. She sat down and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said. "The audit," she said. "The complaint you filed. What made you keep going after HR stopped responding?" I thought about it. The compliance gap was real, I said. It was documented, it was material, and it was affecting accounts that were under active regulatory oversight. The question of whether HR was going to address it was separate from the question of whether it needed to be addressed. "So you separated the two," she said. "Yes," I said. "HR is an internal mechanism. The compliance obligation exists whether or not the internal mechanism is functioning. When the internal mechanism stopped functioning, I looked for the external mechanism." "The audit," she said. "The audit was the scheduled external review." I said. "I didn't create it. It was already coming. I just made sure I was on the right side of it when it arrived." She was quiet. "Were you scared?" she said. "Yes," I said. "I was scared the whole time." She looked at me. "How did you keep going if you were scared?" I thought about it. "Because being scared is about what might happen to you," I said. The compliance problem was about what was happening to the accounts. Those were real healthcare clients with real regulatory obligations. The fear was about me. The problem was about them. She was quiet for a long time. "I have a situation," she said. "Tell me," I said. Her situation was different from mine. Smaller in scale. Earlier in a career, with fewer established documentation habits. But the shape was the same. A process concern that had been raised informally and ignored, compounding quietly while the person who had raised it watched and waited. I listened to the full picture before I said anything. Then I said, "How long ago did you first raise it?" 3 months, she said. "In writing?" She paused. "No," she said. "In a conversation with my supervisor." I said, "Put it in writing today. Email to your supervisor, with a clear description of the concern and the date of the original conversation. Keep a copy." She wrote something. "Then what?" "Document every response you receive," I said. "Every acknowledgement, every non-response, every partial answer. Build a timeline. Not for any immediate purpose, to have a record that is accurate and complete. And if nothing happens after that, then you have a documented concern with a documented history of inaction," I said. Which is a different situation from an undocumented concern. The documented version has options available to it that the undocumented version does not. I paused. My complaint was filed in March. HR acknowledged it 5 times over 3 months and took no substantive action. That inaction is documented. When the audit was announced, the 5-month gap between my first submission and the audit date became part of the record. "So the documentation of the inaction matters as much as the original concern," she said. "Yes," I said. "Both sides of the record matter." She looked at her notepad. "The audit helped you," she said. "The audit was already scheduled," I said. "I didn't need to create an external review. I just needed to be prepared when the existing one arrived." I paused. "In most situations, there's an existing review mechanism or oversight process that will eventually arrive. The question is whether you're prepared when it does." She closed her notepad. "Thank you," she said. The revised compliance process was formally implemented in November. I had been named as the lead compliance associate for the 4 accounts that had been under examination. A formal assignment, documented in the personnel record, that restored what had been removed 14 months earlier when Mr. Crane had begun excluding me from the account meetings. The corrective action period began with a quarterly review in October. The review was clean. The documentation standards we had built in the working group held up under examination. The examiner's report noted that the revised process represented a material improvement over the prior approach. Amara and I had coffee after the October review results came back. She said, "How does it feel?" I thought about it. "Like the work is doing what it's supposed to do," I said. "Not more than that," she said. "Not really," I said. "The accounts are compliant. The process is correct. The documentation is accurate. That's what it was supposed to look like from the beginning." She smiled. "You're very calm about this," she said. "I've been building toward it for 9 months," I said. "By the time the outcome arrives, it's already been processed." She shook her head slightly. "I was watching you across the hall for 4 months," she said. "Building your folder, filing your follow-ups, never letting anything show. I didn't know what you had. I just knew you had something." "You were building something too," I said. "The billing timeline," she said. "I didn't know it was going to matter." "It mattered," I said. "We built the same case from different angles without knowing," she said. "Yes," I said. "That's either lucky or something else," she said. I thought about it. "I think it's what happens when two people in the same situation both decide to document rather than wait and hope," I said. I spoke at the firm's internal compliance training in December. Ms. Okafor had been asked to consult on the training curriculum as part of the corrective action implementation. She had suggested I speak for 15 minutes on documentation practices in compliance work, the professional discipline of maintaining records that accurately reflected processes and decisions. I agreed. I said, "Compliance documentation exists to protect 3 things: the organization, the people the organization serves, and the individual professionals who do the compliance work. When documentation is accurate, those 3 interests are usually aligned. When documentation becomes inaccurate, when the records describe a process that didn't happen, or omit a step that did, those interests begin to diverge." I paused. The gap I identified in February was a divergence. The compliance records describe reviews that had not been conducted per standard process. The accounts were operating on documentation that overstated the compliance work that had actually been done. That divergence was a real risk, to the firm's regulatory standing, to the clients, and eventually, to the individual who had allowed it to develop. I looked around the room. The practice I would encourage you to take from this: document in real time, accurately, under your own name. Not because you expect it to matter, because the records are the only version of events that remains unambiguous when everything else becomes a question of who remembers what and when. After the training, a senior compliance manager named Mr. Abra, who had been with the firm 11 years, found me in the corridor. He said, "I should have seen what was happening sooner." I said, "You see it now." He nodded. "The process we have now is better," he said. "Yes," I said. "That was the point." Auntie Cora came to visit in January. She had asked to see the folder. Not out of professional curiosity. She had understood the documentation from my phone descriptions. She had asked because she wanted to see the physical thing, the accumulated record of 9 months of careful work. I brought it up on my laptop. All 5 sections. Every document in sequence, from the first exclusion instance in October to the corrective action letter in November. She scrolled through it slowly. When she finished, she closed the laptop and sat for a moment. "The original complaint," she said. "March 14th. The acknowledgement receipt from HR. The follow-ups." "Yes," I said. "When you filed that complaint, did you think you were starting a process that would end with an audit finding and a corrective action order?" "No," I said. "I thought I was starting an internal process that should produce an internal correction." "But you built the folder from February," she said. "Before the complaint. You were already building towards something else." I thought about it. "I built the folder because the compliance gap needed to be documented," I said. "Not because I had a plan for what to do with it. The documentation was the discipline. The plan developed from what the documentation made possible." She looked at me. "That's the whole thing," she said. "That's the entire lesson. You don't build the record because you know what you're going to do with it. You build it because the situation deserves an accurate account. And then, when the moment arrives, the audit announcement, the right room, the right question, you have something to show." I had been telling this to other people for months. It was different to hear it described from the outside. "Yes," I said. "That's exactly it. I think about the 6 months between the first complaint and the audit announcement. 6 months where the complaint sat in HR system, acknowledged and unaddressed. 6 months where the compliance gap continued to exist in the account records, growing slightly with each passing quarter. 6 months where I filed follow-ups and received acknowledgments and nothing changed. People have asked me whether I was angry during those months. The honest answer is, yes, but not in the way that felt actionable. The anger was real. The unfairness was real. A documented concern, properly submitted, met with institutional inaction while the underlying problem persisted. That is a real thing to be angry about. But anger, by itself, was not useful to the accounts. What was useful was the folder. Every follow-up and every non-response went into Section 5. The institutional inaction was accumulating alongside the documented compliance gap. The two together were building a picture that was increasingly hard to characterize as anything other than what it was. When the audit was announced, the folder was already complete. The disclosure was drafted. I had been preparing for the external mechanism since the internal mechanism made clear it was not going to function. The waiting was not passive. The waiting was the documentation. The audit found the gap because the gap was real. But it found it quickly and understood its full context, because someone had spent 9 months making sure the record was impossible to misread. That someone was me. The folder was how I waited. When the internal mechanism fails, the external one is still coming. You don't need to create the audit. You just need to be ready when it arrives. Build the record. File it accurately. Document every response and every non-response. Because the gap between what the organization told you would happen and what it actually did is the record that matters most. And when the right moment comes, the audit, the review, the question that needs an answer, the folder speaks.